So, as I said, Stephen Reid is here with us to talk about building phonemic awareness and all of those foundational literacy skills with your pre-literate ELL students. It's a huge topic, and we encourage you to take notes, pay attention, use that Q&A so we can copy down your questions and get them answered. Go ahead. As I said, use the chat to introduce yourself, share links and resources, and ask questions to the group. And use the Q&A to ask questions about the content to Steve. You may not get an answer right away, but we will have a whole Q&A session towards the end of the session. Go ahead. We are recording after every session. We do get that question a lot. So we are recording this session. You will also get a follow-up email with links to the recording, the slideshow, the summary sheet, the chat transcript, Q&A, and all of those things listed on the left-hand side, including your certificate of participation. If you have any further questions, please feel free to let us know in the Q&A. Also, something really important to think about today are those coaching sessions. Stephen offers a variety of times where up to 12 individuals per session can take some time with Stephen to ask very specific questions about this session and how it relates to your particular context. So we encourage you, particularly with this really tough topic, to participate and register in coaching sessions. You will see the links in the chat at some point today when we talk more. Oh, and Danielle went ahead and put those in. Thank you. And if you have any questions about those coaching sessions, Steve will get an opportunity to tell you a little bit more about that. Go ahead to the next slide. Here's the details about those coaching sessions. Again, 1 to 3 weeks after the webinars and up to 12 participants per session. And it is not a repeat of this session. Something that we want to make clear. This is not a repeat of this session. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions specific to your context about the content that is presented today. So please come to those sessions prepared with some questions about today's topic. Go ahead. So some additional resources for all of you. We do have a scholarship for participants that are joining our TTP or our Teacher Training Plus webinars. You can apply for that using the link on the screen, and that material is about $1,000 in scholarship money for $900 in materials plus the shipping and handling. You get to select one of those offerings, and the scholarships are limited, so please apply with the link provided. And we will also share some information about membership with you. There's a link, and Danielle will put that in the chat box. It is a free 1-year membership to ProLiteracy for participating in one of our webinars. And the deadline to apply for both is May 10th, so that's coming rather quickly. Okay, next slide. And new for all of you is the free interactive voting guide that comes to you from ProLiteracy. It is an interactive voting guide for your adult learners that explains who can vote, why every vote counts, and describes how we choose our leaders in the US. It also gives information and resources for how to register to vote and cast your ballot. The link is included in the chat box. Okay, next. And without further ado, I will leave Stephen to start his presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about being here today for this presentation. And this is one that has been really a fascinating subject for me as I've been digging in and working more with lower level learners. And so this is a topic that I'm very excited about working on with you guys and talking through, and I'm hoping that you're going to get a lot out of it. You've all, I was looking through all the chat people introducing themselves, and I recognize so many of those names. So it's good to see you all here. I'm not going to go through my bio. If you want to read that, you can, but I'm guessing most of you already know me by this point. So I'm just glad that you guys are back here with me. So I am going to turn off my camera. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is how do we get started working on reading with somebody who is at that pre-literate level of learning. So they don't have much literacy or maybe any literacy in their first language. And how do we get started working with them as we're just getting them to learn to read in English? So that is the giant topic we're going to try to cover in the next 50 minutes. So let's dive in. But as we're getting started, I want us to start with just, let's dive into a little bit of realism. I'm going to ask some questions, and I want you to answer these in the chat. Okay? So, how long did it take you to get to where you were at a fourth grade reading level? Okay? All the way back from before you were, as you were learning your ABCs, from the very, very beginning when you were learning your ABCs, up to a point where you were proficient at a fourth grade reading level. Okay. I'm seeing some answers come through. Some people got there quick. Some people took a little bit longer. Generally, I'm guessing it's in that 4 to 5 to 6 year range. Some people, by the time they were second or third graders, got there. Some took a little bit longer, but from the time we were pre-school age until we were at that point where we were reading at a fourth grade level, somewhere in the 4 to 6 year length of time. Okay. During that time, when you were in school, how many days of direct instruction in reading were you getting every year? Okay. How many days of direct instruction? Okay. If any of your classroom teachers, you can probably jump in with that exact number. Yep, I'm seeing it, the 180 days. We've got some classroom teachers here. 180 days a school year, because that's pretty much the standard all over the U.S. So about 180 days of actual direct instruction in that kindergarten, first, second, third, or up to fourth grade, those years that you were in school. Okay, that's direct instruction from an educator. That does not include, as Tara put in there, extra help from parents along the way during the summers. So during that time, how many hours of direct and indirect instruction were you getting per day when you were in school? Okay. Roughly, how many direct exactly based on reading, and then on the periphery of reading that came through in other subjects. I am betting it was about 2 hours of direct reading instruction, give or take, and then another 3 or 4 hours of instruction on things like science and social studies and such that all came through in and helped build those reading skills. So we're looking at 180 days a year of direct instruction, about 6 to 8 hours during your school day that you were working on this. Okay, so now again, thinking back to that time where you were in kindergarten, first, second grade, how many hours a week were you working during that time at a job outside the home? You went to work, you clocked in, and you were actually working, like in as something outside of the home. I'm seeing a lot of zeros coming through there. So yeah, I'm gonna bet it was 0. Okay, and it took you 3 to 4 to 5 years to get to that point where you were reading at a 4th grade level. And you were doing it all in a language you heard every single day of your life if you are a native English speaker. Okay? So, why is it that we expect an adult who comes into our program who has 0 literacy in their first language to be able to do it, to be able to get to a point where they are reading at a 3rd or 4th grade level in a year, when they're meeting with us from 2 to 6 hours a week, working full time with kids and families and all the other obligations that they have in their lives, thinking about what's going on in their lives. How do we expect our students to do it quicker than what we did it when we were kids? Okay? That's really something I want us to all be thinking about through all of the presentations today. We need to make sure we have realistic expectations of our students. We need to make sure that we have, we are setting reasonable goals so that they can progress at the level that is reasonable for them in this stage in their lives. Okay. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is we're going to be looking at a little bit of how the brain functions are connected and how they're connected to reading. Then we're going to look at some phonemic awareness, and then some decoding skills, and some vocabulary, and how we add vocabulary in and tie that into reading and its importance as we're digging into reading. So let's start with thinking about the brain itself and how that is connected into reading. There are at least 5 areas of the brain that are connected to reading. And all of these sections must communicate back and forth with each other in order for you to be able to read. Like the part of your brain that sees the word bird and the part that functions into converting those letters into sounds and making the sounds work within your head and getting that all together to let you understand that these 4 letters represent this animal and how all of those pieces come together. It takes at least 5 sections of the brain talking to each other in order to get there. If you're interested in reading a bit more about this, the link is going to be available in the follow-up sheet that comes through. So those pathways that connect the different parts of your brain do not exist in a preliterate brain. And that's true whether we're talking about somebody who's working in their native language and they're 3 years old, but they do not read yet, or somebody who is an adult who has never learned to read in any language. It doesn't matter how old the person is, the pathways that connect those different parts of the brain do not exist naturally. Those pathways must be built. Okay? So that's something we have to think about. All of those 5 sections have to talk to each other, and if we think about that as like a highway system running into various parts of our brain, we have to build those highways to get all of those pieces talking to each other. In most illiterate people, those pathways are built while we're children. And the great thing about that for children is that's what their brain is doing all day, every day, is building pathways so that they can get to a point where they're using all the pieces of their brain and in coordination with the other pieces, and everything's working together. And so as a kid, we are very much digging into the idea of like our brains are just learning everything they can. As an adult, it takes longer to create those new pathways. As a child, those pathways are like constantly under construction. As a kid, you're learning all day, every day. Everything you're doing is about building new understanding of the world around you. And so your brain is designed to take in as much information and build those pathways as quickly as they can. In an adult brain, it takes longer. It takes more time to build those pathways. This link is also going to be available to you in the follow-up information. I highly recommend looking into the science of reading. I think it is going to be eye-opening for a lot of people in what it takes to get the brain to learn how to read and the science behind that. So let's talk a little bit about phonemic awareness. As I'm sure you all know, phonemes are the smallest unit of individual sound. So like in the word cat, for example, cat has 3 phonemes, cat, ta. And so it's the little individual pieces of sound that are mushed together to create a word. And keep in mind, I'm talking about sound at this point. I'm not looking at letters. I only am thinking about sounds. So the word catch also has 3 phonemes, the ka, the a, and the cha. Even though that cha in English is written in this word as a TCH, 3 letters, it's not what we're thinking about here. This isn't about how what letters are used to create it. It's just about the sounds. Okay, so phonemic awareness isn't phonics. This doesn't have anything to do with letters at this point. It's just about the sound. Okay. So as we're building phonemic awareness, it is really important, particularly if you're working with a pre-literate adult, that vocabulary has to come first. Okay? And you're going to hear me repeat this about 1,000 times through this entire webinar because it is so important that vocabulary comes first. They have to start with words they already know, particularly short words. You can use those to help get you to a point where it's easier for your student to manipulate sounds because they already know the words and the sounds. So when you're breaking apart the vocabulary for them, when it's a word they already know, it's easier to manipulate those sounds. As you're teaching new vocabulary, you also should be breaking apart those sounds as you teach it. So every time you're teaching new vocabulary words, break apart the individual phonemes so that they're really hearing how the word is put together. That's going to help you a great deal when you get into reading with that word later. But it's also a bonus feature in that it improves pronunciation when they're learning the new vocabulary. I think it's really important to get pronunciation correct whenever you are working on that new vocabulary, pulling in new vocabulary, get the pronunciation locked in right away. If you have questions about pronunciation, I have a webinar that's available on YouTube that that Danielle will be able to link for you, and you can find it through the Teacher Training Plus series, and that will help you working on pronunciation. And in that, I also say, get that pronunciation right whenever you're teaching the word. And this is another place where, in this case, it's going to become important for you in reading to get that pronunciation right, breaking apart those individual sounds. So I think that it's really important to start focusing on how do we identify sounds. And if you were with me for my last presentation, you know that I do not favor the idea of starting with A and going to Z when learning the alphabet. And it's the exact same whenever we're looking at phonemes. Don't start with A and go straight to Z. Start with a small set of sounds that they likely already know. And again, you have the sounds that they're going to be familiar with, like those in their names, those in their families' names and such. But there's also a set of sounds that exist in most languages. 96% of languages have a M sound, 90% have a K, 86% have a P, 78% have a N, and 68% have a T. So these 5 sounds in particular already exist in the language they're coming from, most likely. So if you start with the sounds that they already know, it will be easier for them to manipulate those sounds in English. And so you'll have an easier time getting them to break the words apart into sounds, because they already recognize a lot of the phonemes. It's a bit trickier on vowels than it is with consonants, because most languages don't have the crazy number of vowel sounds that we have, but in the consonants, it is a little bit easier. I think it's really important to explicitly teach these sounds so that they understand exactly how the sound is made, and that could include looking at just, having them hold up a mirror in front of yourself as they're making the m sound. What is going on with their teeth and their tongue and their lips and the vocal passage, and where's the sound coming from? And looking at each of those sounds explicitly will help your student get a better understanding as you're breaking it down into letters later. But we start with that foundation of just getting the sound right. I don't think this is something that you should overwhelm them on. Trying to go through 15 sounds in a day is overkill. It's going to lead to frustration and confusion. So maybe only 1 or 2 per lesson, but breaking them apart into those individual sounds and working through that just a little bit each lesson will help get you there. You really want to get your student comfortable with the mouth feel. How does the sound feel in the mouth as you are creating it, and what can they do to make sure that is happening correctly? Something I think is useful is very simple tongue twisters, and the ones that I'm going to show you, tongue twister is a stretch to say that these are tongue twisters. They're mostly short sentences that all start with the same letter. Mary makes a mess on Mondays. Kate kept Ken's kitten. Paul pulled the pink puppy. Nate was not nice to Nick's neighbor. Tom took too many tomatoes. So looking at those individual sounds and just kind of being able to repeat those over and over so that they feel locked into it. You may want to help grab some pictures to help you with these. All of these pictures, the 3 pictures here, were created using GenCraft, which is AI, and I just typed in the picture, Tom took too many tomatoes, and that's the picture it created for me. So you can use something like that to help you find a very specific picture, because I'm guessing finding a guy with a pink puppy is going to be a bit tricky just to pull that picture off the internet. So just have AI create it for you. GenCraft is basically free. Like, you can log in for free and you get a certain number of pictures for free. And then after you get so many pictures, then you have to start paying for them. But I think it's like you get like 3 or 4 pictures a week or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's not much. It's not many pictures, but it's also free. So using something like that can help you to create that picture and to go along with the sentence. So even though they're not at a point where they're reading this sentence, they probably already know some of those words. Like Tom, they would know it was a guy's name. Took or take and tomatoes, they probably know those. And so from the picture, they can get what the sentence is about. Another way to start working on those vowels is, because like I said earlier, vowels are tricky because not every language has those. But I want you to do this with me, so we'll all look weird staring at our computers in our offices across the country together. So in English language, there are 19 or 20-ish vowel phonemes. It depends on who you ask. I've seen 19 seems to be a very common number, but I see 20 just as often. So I don't know. Linguists argue a lot. But place your hand flat underneath your chin, and I'll turn on my camera just for a second to show you what I'm doing. So right underneath your chin, place your hand just where it's flat. Okay, hope everybody can see that. So then go down the list of the words in this chart, and it's kind of small, so I hope you can see it. But beat, bit, bait, bet, bat, bite, bot. As you were doing that, you were feeling how far down your chin pulls on each of those vowel sounds. You would also likely be feeling the vibration of the sounds moving backwards in your mouth from the e up at the very front, e, to the ah, which happens at the back of your mouth. So thinking about that, how your lips were shaped, and how much movement we get out of our jaw on each of those sounds as we go through them. So using that to help break down those individual phonemes with the vowel sounds, something like that's going to be helpful, particularly if you have a student who comes to us from maybe a Central African language where they have 5 vowel sounds, and that's it. And then they try to get to our 19 or 20, and it gets overwhelming. So using something like that will help you teach those individual phonemes. Okay. So I think it's important for us to remember that instruction must have meaning. And this is way more important with adults than it is with kids. Okay? It's fun to have the nonsense and playfulness when you're a 6-year-old, because that gets the imagination going and it's fun and we just have a good time with the nonsense. When you're working with adults, they most likely don't have time in their lives for the nonsense. They need everything to be important for what they're working on in their lives. And so in their lessons, they want everything to be moving toward a specific goal. And so I think it's important for us to keep in mind that using nonsense words when you're working with adults isn't necessarily recommended. It can work if the student has English as a first language, if they're already native English speakers, and they see that in this case, we're looking at the og and different things at the beginning of it. And so we're making nonsense words that they don't know and that they would not know because they're just made up words. A native English speaker would understand that and would see where you're going with it. Kids think that the words sound funny and they're happy to go along with it. But English language learners are going to find the words confusing. And so they're going to be looking up gog or stog or chog in their dictionary and trying to find a definition for those words. And it's going to make the lesson more confusing. So I don't recommend using nonsense words or made-up words when I'm teaching phonemic awareness to adult English language learners. Adults who have English as a first language or to kids, it's a very useful technique. But with adult English language learners, it can actually dig you into some problems that you don't really want to deal with. And so activities to teach phonemic awareness, one of the things I always say whenever I'm giving a presentation, I want you to walk away with some things that you can use in your lessons. So activities that I find that are useful, word games, particularly if you're trying to find rhyming words and rhyming sounds. So things like that can be fun. Very short, the consonant vowel consonant words are a great way to start, particularly if it's the ones that follow the rules, like that are very clearly following the rules of pronunciation. Cat, bat, mat, hat. So swapping out that first consonant, the last part of the word all sounds the same. And so they follow the rules very clearly. And I think that those are useful. Very basic tongue twisters like the ones that I showed you, where it's mostly just alliteration. I think those can be very helpful. Rhymes, poetry and song can be great. Rhymes exist in all the languages. Songs exist in most languages. So using that idea can be helpful for the student because they're already in that, their lives already have that in their primary language. And so whenever you're introducing it in English, they're fine with the concept because they already had it. Even if they are from a non-literate society, most of the non-literate societies rely heavily on song as a storytelling technique. And so you would be able to have some success with that and using song and poetry in your time working with your student. Also doing activities that where having your student rearrange pictures so that the first sound we hear is all the same, or the middle sound, or the final sound. So bowl, fork, desk, note, dog, walk. You may have to walk through and make sure that they understand what the picture is of, and then have them separate them into pairs. So dog and desk have that matching initial sound. Bowl and note have that middle sound. Those vowels are the same. And then walk and fork both end in that ka sound. So those are some activities you can use when working with your student to kind of help them break apart the sounds. Remember, we're just worrying about sounds at this point, but breaking apart those sounds and making sure they understand them. Okay. There are some potential traps that you need to think about. For example, you are likely to have sounds in English that they don't have in their first language. The th and the sounds in particular are not terribly common sounds. And so there are going to be lots of languages that struggle with those. But we also have to deal with the fact that they're going to have have sounds in their language that we don't have. The voiceless velar fricative kha out of the Persian languages is an example of one of those sounds that we don't have, both the voiced and the voiceless kha and the ga that we don't use. And so those are some things that you're going to need to be thinking about as you're working with your student on sound, because you're going to have to teach them how to form certain sounds with their mouths that they are not comfortable with or familiar with. So, looking at decoding and word analysis, in decoding, that's that process of taking printed words and translating it into speech. So we're moving from when we see a group of letters and we put them all together and a word either forms in our head and we hear it in our head, or we're able to actually create the word and it comes out of our mouth. But turning that from a collection of letters or correct collection of written symbols into speech. That's what we're talking about with decoding. This requires us to identify letters, associate those letters to sounds, blend those sounds together to create syllables and words, and conclude what that word is being, how it represents, or how it is being represented by that collection of letters. And so we're moving from, we see a collection of letters, we associate each of those letters with a sound, we put those all together and we create a word, and we know that that word means this thing. And so being able to take all of that and put it together to create from a written word to a spoken word can be, it actually is a pretty impressive task that we're able to do. And so when you're working with somebody who is brand new to literacy, this can be a fairly monumental task. And you may be thinking, wow, we spent a lot of times on just sounds at the beginning of this. And it's because we need to make sure that our students, when we get to this point, they can identify letters and associate those letters to sounds, and making that connection back and forth between sound and letters. There are some unfortunate problems with the English language as far as identifying letters to sounds. We have about 48 total phonemes in the English language. As you know, we have 26 symbols, 26 letters to create those sounds, but those letters can be put into about 250 combinations to create those 48 sounds. And so because English is not a truly phonetic language, it gets very tricky as we're going through some of this process and helping students connect letters and sounds to words. So helping the student identify those phonemes, that's what we were talking about earlier with breaking apart each of those sounds that we're hearing, and how does that connect together to create and how do we put those together to create the graphemes? The graphemes are the letters. Those are the symbols that we're using to create the individual words. And so these are strategies that have to move both directions, that we're going from identifying the phoneme and creating the grapheme, or seeing the grapheme and turning that back into a phoneme. So moving back and forth between the sound and the word, and the sound and the letter. And then how do we put those letters all together and see if we can identify common spelling patterns. Again, as we all know, English spelling is a disaster. And so we often are going to be looking for patterns as best we can, but it is something that we have to think about. And then the next step is going to be looking at word families. Like if we're looking at happy, happily, happiness, how all of those, how you start with that root and with different prefixes, suffixes, and such. How do we put those together to create other parts of speech or connections to those words? This is a skill, the word families and such, that is a skill that comes later. It is not something that I would dive right into with a low-level learner who is not literate in their first language. I think that you can overwhelm them trying to jump from happy to happily to happiness and showing those connections. That's going to get overwhelming. So you got to be very careful and not dive into that too much at those earlier levels. Just stick with the one that they're going to need. Happy would be the one I'd start with. Whenever we're thinking about that blending and segmenting, the mushing the sounds together or splitting them all apart, it's something that we have to be able to do both directions. In the spoken word, it's the breaking down of the sounds into breaking down words into individual sounds. So again, we have that k, a, t that we were looking at earlier. In the written form, it's breaking down words into their individual letters, like the C, A, T. And again, this is something that we have to be able to do back and forth, swapping it from the sound to the letters to the sound. And then we having to put all of that together and recognizing the meaning of that combination of sounds, that combination of letters, and how that all represents a single object. Yeah. As you're looking at some decoding activities, you can take a word and break it apart into its individual sounds and provide those for the student. So if I were doing this at a very, very basic level, I would provide the student with the sounds that I want to put into each of these boxes. As we're moving a little higher up and the student has a little bit more practice with it, we can just go with as it is here, where they see how many sounds this word has, but they don't get the list of what those sounds are going to be. And then to take that up to the next level, you just show them the picture, and they have to break it apart into sounds, but you don't tell them going in how many sounds that's going to be. So in this case, we see the dog there. The dog has three phonemes attached to it: the d, a, and g. The brick has 4 b, r, I, and k. And the shoe has 2, so the sh and the u. And so you could do this either in any of those levels. And probably what I would do is I would start with it where they know how many blanks there are, and they're provided with all of the possible sounds that are going to go into the blanks, and then kind of scaffold out of that so that they can get to that point. But I would, but again, this is something that I would be doing a little higher level with the student whenever they're starting to connect the graphemes and the phonemes. So they're already starting to get some understanding of what the sounds and the letters that make those sounds are all about. Okay. This is not a day one activity. And so, if you have questions on some of the activities, this would be those are great for the coaching sessions. So if you want to jump into a coaching session, we can talk more about some of the activities that I am referencing in the presentation today. So as you're doing this, I want you to keep in mind that students who are not literate in their first language may not understand the connection between sounds and letters. They may have no connection whatsoever that this symbol represents that sound. And so that is something that we have to teach explicitly, that we go from that sound, and once it enters their brain, it gets them to the letter A, because of your explicit teaching. That's not something that's going to happen automatically. The student may not have any connection of how those sounds are used to represent letters and how letters are connected to a sound. And like I said, all of this must be taught explicitly. There are some potential traps here too. Students who are literate in a language that uses the Latin alphabet, just like English does, may have sounds mapped to different letters than what we do. I think a prime example of this is the vowels in Spanish and Portuguese. I was working with a Brazilian student, and he asked me how to spell these. And I said These. And that is what he wrote, because the E sound is connected to the I in his language. So the mapping of the sound and the name of the letter did not match what he's comfortable with. So I had to explain my E's versus his E's. And so that is something that you need to be thinking about. If you have a student who has some literacy in another language that uses that Latin alphabet, they may have them mapped to different sounds. Okay. If you have a student who has some literacy in a non-alphabetic writing system, they may struggle with the concept of letter to vowel or letter to sound, one single letter to a single sound. If you look at the syllabaries where they have a symbol is connected to both a consonant and a vowel, that can be a bit of a struggle for some students. Whenever they get to English, they are looking at, they're like, wait, this letter doesn't have a vowel attached to it. So it might be a little confusing for them. So from here, we're going to dive into vocabulary and how we are going to connect that into the early reading process. For emergent literacy students, vocabulary is absolutely the first place you have to start. They have to have the vocabulary in their heads before they can start reading it. I am a firm believer in pre-teaching vocabulary. At the very beginning of my lessons, I always start with what is the vocabulary we're going to need for this lesson. I try to keep it around the 5 new word mark so that we're all starting, we're not overwhelming them with too many words at the beginning. But I will provide them with a list of the new words. They may not be able to read them yet, but they might be able to pick out some of the letters and how some of those letters are connected to certain sounds. But I do give them the list in written form either way, so that as we are working through those 3 to 5 new words and we're making those sounds and we're creating that connection between proper pronunciation and the sounds and the words, they are able to follow along on the paper, even if they can't really read it yet, making that connection, particularly to those high frequency words. We get those out of the way first, and they see them, but then we really focus on pronouncing them. And then once they're good with that, then we can start looking at that connection between this sound, this letter, this sound, this letter, this sound, this letter. And I feel like that's going to be really important when you're working with your students. It takes multiple exposures for a word to really get locked into place. Typically, you need to be thinking about a dozen exposures um, before it really locks in for most people. Some, it can take up to 20. Some can do it as few as 5. But just in general, they need to hear a word. They need to be exposed to a word. Excuse me. They need to expose a word multiple times before it starts locking into place. As you are working on those words, make sure you're focusing on those phonemes. You're not skipping over pronunciation. Focus on those phonemes, and then that connection between the phoneme and the grapheme. How is this letter sounding in the word? What are we doing? How is the pronunciation happening? And then looking at that connection between the individual letter and the sound, or the letter combinations and the sound, and what can we do to make sure that they're locking those two things together. I think it can be tricky for whenever you're going through vocabulary, if you're focusing too heavily on semantic sets. Too many colors at one time can get confusing. Too many different foods all at the same time, they can start mushing them all together. How many of us have heard a student use the word chicken for kitchen, particularly among Spanish speakers who have lower level literacy? You'll hear that that mistake happen pretty frequently, where they just, the two words are associated with one another, and they end up getting confusing. So you want to be careful with that. In general, whenever you're teaching vocabulary, you're going to want to be thinking about pictures, realia, cognates. For more information on this, you can go to my webinar on scaffolding. I've got the link down there on the slide. I'm betting that you'll be seeing it pop up in the chat pretty quickly, because Danielle is great like that. So if you want to jump over to my scaffolding one, I spend a lot more time talking about vocabulary there and how to teach it. I think as you're working through making that connection between the phonemes, the graphemes, and how we put all that together into creating words, I think the important thing is to always be looking for level appropriate texts. And one of the questions I get so often is, how do you find text that is going to be helpful when you're working with an emergent literacy student, somebody whose literacy level is so low and non-existent in their first language, but how do you get started with them? One of my favorite book series comes out of Grassroots Press. And if you think about how most of us learn to read, we were looking at a picture book that had a picture of a dog on it, and it said, see spot run spot run. And we were using that picture and a simple sentence below it to learn that connection between these words and that picture. They told the story. This series from Grassroots Press, some of their books have a Lexile level all the way down to 80, which is kind of a kindergarten level reader. And the nice thing about this series is they are all on adult topics. So this one, A Bad Car Day, by Linda Keita Bradley. It's about a woman who she needs to go to the bank and get some money, and her car breaks down, and so she's having a tough time. There's others in the series, like A Good Night's Sleep, which has a Lexile level of about 160, so about a first grade level, and it's about a woman who is just running herself in circles and needs a good night's sleep, something I bet a lot of us could relate to. And the nice thing about this series is they're all built on topics that adults can connect to. And even though I do not work for Grassroots Press, I actually don't think I've ever even met any of their sales reps. I am a big believer in this product. And so I think that you will find these books to be helpful when you're working with those that level. I'll have the link to how to find Grassroots Press in the follow-up sheet. So as you are moving forward in working with reading, the first thing I want you to think about is reading is likely the third skill they're going to develop. Speaking and listening are going to come first, then reading, and then much, much later, they're going to pick up writing, particularly when you're looking at writing in terms of like creative writing or, essay writing, things like that. Those skills usually come much, much later. In order to learn how to read, they're going to need to have that vocabulary. You have to start with words, particularly starting with words that they know. And I think that's going to be the things that you're going to need to keep in mind as you are getting started working with somebody as they're just moving into reading. There are some potential traps here. Overloading students with too many new words is the quickest way to get them to shut down their brains. Like I said, 3 to 5 new words is probably the most I would do in a lesson when I'm working with a lower level student. You really want to make sure that they're going to be comfortable and not feel overwhelmed. Also, again, looking at the joy of English, but actually this one isn't a situation that's exclusive to English. But if you've got students who are really good at listening comprehension and their reading just isn't quite there, there's going to be some confusion between common pronunciations of some words and then how they are written. So, the written form going to becomes gonna, sandwich becomes sandwich or sandwich or sandwich. And so like that D is pretty much non-existent, and sometimes the W is too. And then, a phrase like raise your hand, quickly you lose that ya in your very, very quickly in most American dialects. So, how sounds are created versus how they're written and how they're created in just regular colloquial speech. That's something that can get confusing to some of our learners. So I guess my final thoughts on this topic are really going to center around the idea of looking at taking your time, thinking about how long it took you to get to be a 4th grade reader, and then from there, break down the sounds individually, then turn those into letters and make that connection between the sounds and the letters, and really explicitly teaching how all of those pieces are fitting together, because you've got to build a lot of pathways in order to get them to be able to read. And those pathways don't exist. So it's our job to make them happen. We have a QR code. If you've got your phones handy, you can take a quick picture of that QR code, and then you can give me some feedback. The thing that we do with the feedback that we get from you guys, it helps me as a presenter. What can I do to make my presentations better for you? I am always trying to find ways to improve, and your feedback is very, very helpful. It will also help ProLiteracy as a whole, because it will help us decide what are the other presentations that you may be wanting and that could be useful for you in the future. All the feedback surveys are read very carefully. We look them over, and we really want to hear what you have to say. So we appreciate it if you do that. You'll also get that link whenever you get the follow-up stuff. There is one more webinar in the Teacher Training Plus series for 2023, and that is on mathematics on April 18th. So instructional routines for building number sense and using structures. Her webinars are so good. If you were working with a student on math, I think it's worth your time to go just so you can to learn from her. And that takes us to question time.
All right.
And I'm going to
So we have
stop
quite a few questions, so I'll just jump right into them. One person
before we get into the questions,
sure.
I know we're at the top of the hour, and some of you are going to have to be cutting out. We will be recording all of the questions and answers, so you can, if you listen to the webinar once we send it back out, you'll still get to hear all the answers. So even if you have to leave early, we understand, but that gets you those as well. But if you have questions that don't get answered now, keep in mind those coaching sessions are coming up, and this is that's a great opportunity for you to spend some time just chatting one-on-one about this topic. Okay, Maribel, sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that was a great segue to the questions. So the first person says, what is your view on how to introduce both phonemes and letter names without confusing students?
So a lot of times what I would focus on first is the sound, get the sounds right, and then a little bit later start tying in the letter A. Its name is A, and it sounds like ah or ah or a. And so typically I start with the sound and then would move to the letter name. But I think a case could be made either direction. I like working with the sound first.
Great. What can we do with students that don't have an English vocabulary to use?
So you start with that. You have to start with that. You can put on hold the reading activities until you can get enough vocabulary under their belts. And then you can start the reading. But you've got to get to, you've got to get that vocabulary first. And so, you know, the point I was trying to make early on, this is not something you're going to do in a couple of weeks. You're not going to take them from non-literate, non-English speaking to a strong English speaking reader in a month. It's not going to happen. And so start with that vocabulary first. Great.
What about using nonsense words with ELLs that are kids?
So I'm going to start by saying ELLs who are kids are not an area where I have any form of expertise. I have not spent a lot of time working with people under the age of 18. And so I don't know that I can speak, you know, with any level of confidence on saying that it's okay or not okay. I would think that you'd be able to get away with it because they are learning so much vocabulary that they'd be able to parse out the difference between real words and nonsense words fairly quickly, and they're not going to rush off to their dictionary and try to define the nonsense words. They're just going to play along. So I'm thinking with kids it's going to be a little better, but like I said, pedagogy is not my strong suit. I'm much more of an andragogy kind of guy.
Speaking of which, when you say word games, can you be more specific? What kind of word games?
Rhyming games, or words, games that have you making small changes to sounds, taking it from one word to the next. Games that are matching pictures with words, and yeah, things like that.
Great. Is there a reading curriculum you recommend for pre-literate adult learners?
As far as working with pre-literate English language learners, uh, I will tell you that I have found a lot of success with the Ventures series from Cambridge University Press. I have used them for several years now, and I find it to be useful and helpful and gets us where we're going. Their basic book has two different workbooks, one that is kind of written at the basic level, and one that's written at the literacy level, which is even lower. And so I find that to be valuable. However, I have started to see a lot of other textbook series that also do that dual workbook with the basic level. So they have that ability to go with a much lower level whenever they are looking at that basic level. So that dual workbook can be very, very helpful.
Thank you. How do you teach diphthong phonemes? Our learners hear them as two sounds.
So, well, because they kind of are two sounds, sort of. We just practice those, and by whenever we're looking at the the toy, the OE sound, we get to the O and the and we just kind of mush, and we practice mushing them together. It's just one of those that you just got to keep practicing. And yes, it is two sounds, but they're said really, really quickly together to create that single-ish sound. It's practice.
Are there phonemic awareness materials that you shared in the slideshow available for purchase?
There are lots of phonemic awareness products that are available for purchase. I don't have any that off the top of my head that I could say this is the set that is going to be great. I can do some looking around and see what I can find, and maybe I'll be able to share those in a coaching session.
Excellent. A few more questions. Our beginning workbook starts off with a lot of contractions, which are to be read and written. This seems more suited to improving speech comprehension, but hard to read and explain. When do you teach contractions in ELL reading?
So I will teach contractions in spoken form very, very early, because the students are going to hear them. In written form, because it's in the early parts of the book, we do kind of hit them early on, but I'm with you that I find it to be a bit problematic that they are pushing contractions at a very, very early spot in the textbooks. Like, I understand why they're doing it. I don't know that it's the best idea.
For adult learners at the pre-literate level, how long of a class period do you suggest? How long is too long?
How long is too long? So I find that, working for about 50-ish minutes, maybe 50 minutes to an hour, and then take a break for about 15 minutes, and then come back and do another 45 in a 2-hour session seems to be pretty successful. But I tend to put it a little longer on the first half and then take the break kind of in the second hour. But about 2 hours seems to be comfortable for most people. But that is going to depend on the student. Some people can't hang for that long. And so you may want to limit that. But I find that 2 hours is about right.
Are there any products you recommend that automate part of the process? A computer program that literacy learners can use to practice phonics, especially a system that is adult ESL specific?
I wish such a thing existed. Like it's gotten to the point where my executive director and I have talked about creating this thing ourselves, because we also are on the constant lookout for a learning program, an app, a software package that caters very heavily to lowest level students. And so I find that some of the programs that exist, like Rosetta Stone or USA Learns or Burlington, all of those go down fairly far, but not far enough for English language learners. I would like to see programs that go much, much lower with those basic emergent literacy students.
Someone else says, I am assuming that teaching the phonemes is done orally by modeling the sound, but not actually having the student learn the graphic.
Right. I start with the phonemes. I start with just the sounds, and then we'll add the graphing later. So spend that time working on the spoken vocabulary, build that vocabulary up, get the vocabulary strong, and then circle back, looking at the same vocabulary, and then add the graphemes.
The next person asked if you have heard of the color vowel chart. I find it very helpful for students to identify the color of vowel sounds by comparing the stressed syllable to a color and keywords by listening to the sound, not the letters.
So I am familiar with the color vowel system. And personally, I find there are some holes in it. And some of it can be very useful, making those connections between similar sounding words. But I find that it can be useful as a jumping off point, and can be good for some sounds, but it doesn't dig in as far as I would like it to. And I also don't always agree with their pronunciation of which sounds they are putting in which color.
Great. Did you, the next person asked if you mentioned stress when teaching the pronunciation of vocabulary words.
If you go into my webinar on pronunciation, I do spend a lot of time talking about stress. So yes, it is important, but as it is, this presentation was running long, and so I couldn't hit too many things. I had to edit things out as it was. But yes, so jump to that other, my presentation on pronunciation.
This next person said, I'm teaching a beginner's class. The majority of the students can read. However, there are a few students who could use some help with phonemic awareness. Any recommendations on what I can do?
So that's just the joy of a multi-level class. You're always gonna anybody who's been teaching in a classroom model of English language learners, you are very familiar with that multi-level classroom. So in the when you're working in that situation, it helps if you have some aides in the class, people who can help you out. If you don't, then what you may want to do is get the higher level students kind of moving in one direction and kind of give them some tasks, and then spend a little time working one-on-one or one-on-two or one-on-four with those who are working in that lower section. You can also create a bit of a buddy system where you have other people in the class who are helping those who are working who are a little bit lower. So a lot of the same techniques you would do in any multi-level classroom, but it's a bit trickier whenever you have those who aren't literate.
All right,
Okay,
I'm going to pass it over to Danielle.
Yeah, there were a few that were stragglers in the chat that I want to address before you take off, Stephen.
Okay.
Well, the first one is, any suggestions for books to use with Afghan women?
I don't necessarily have anything that's specific to Afghan women.
Okay. And then for adult learners at the pre-literate level, how long of a class period would you suggest? Our classes are currently 3 hours, 3 times a week in general, but I feel like this level burns out much more quickly. How long is too long?
Okay, so if somebody else has decided you're meeting for 3 hours, 3 days a week, then, you know, if that's what they've decided, you're kind of stuck with it. But what you can do is divide that time up, so you're not just doing 3 hours of, you know, strenuous instruction. Spend, you know, maybe about an hour on something, take a break, and then after you come back from break, you know, play some games, do some stuff that has people up moving around, and is you know, still working on some learning techniques, but gets people up and moving and running back and forth to the whiteboard or whatever. So you've got some interaction where everybody's up and moving, and then take another little break, and then go back and maybe do some activities that put both the pieces together. So dividing that 3 hours up into different pieces, and having, you know, maybe the middle piece be a real kinesthetic type activity, that can be helpful. And, you know, just, you know, singing some songs and playing some games and, you know, doing some, you know, chants and things like that. Just have some fun with it, and it makes the 3 hours bearable for those who can't really sit, you know, nose to the grindstone for 3 hours.
Okay. And last one, how do you teach the transition from written to spoken, broken in syllable words to the contracted one in a sentence?
So that was harder. But a lot of times the student will have heard the contracted version and may not realize that that's what's happened. And so I will usually teach that, you know, for example, cannot to can't. I will just, like, you know, show them that these two words mean the same thing. If we're using that with, you know, like, just if I'm working just in spoken form, you know, there's a lot of hand gestures in there that take cannot and can't to just kind of mushing it all together, and using some, you know, charades to get me there if I'm doing it just in spoken form.
Okay, great. And that's all I have.
Okay. Well, one more shameless plug for my coaching sessions for those who are still around. I know that you're going to get out of here and you're going to be like, oh, wait, I have more questions. That's exactly what those coaching sessions are for. It's about me. It's me and about 10 people getting in, talking, and seeing what we can come up with to answer your questions. So I really look forward to seeing you guys there. I know that those coaching sessions are already open. Danielle put the link in the chat a little bit ago. So I'm hoping to see you guys there.